Hi, and welcome to the 60th episode in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. Today, we're going to have a fun episode of World War II in the Middle East, and let's see how we go. So the rules, for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing tonight. I am here as a lay expert, and the other individuals who will be presenting throughout the night alongside me are also lay experts. So we are not accredited, but hopefully we have enough information to impart that you will enjoy it. And we're going to impart that from a secular perspective. We're not going to try and choose sides. We're going to enjoy it from all vantage points. And of course, World War II involves a lot of sensitive topics, so let's be respectful like we are of every other thing that we talk about in the Middle Eastern history series. But that said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, concerns, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I also I'm going to say that this is going to be a discussion as opposed to a typical class, and other members of this group, History Mostly Ancient Discussions, are much more detail-oriented when it comes to World War II than I am, and I think this is a great crossover where those individuals can sort of work with me and we can give you the best presentation we can, where I come at it from the Middle Eastern perspective and they come at it with the more centralized perspective. Now, at 2 hours at 9 p.m. Eastern time, I will stop that as a hard stop. If there are more slides, that's okay. We'll roll that over to after the break, and we will reconvene after the break on the 19th of January. That will be our next meeting. But after 2 hours, you know that I'm not going to say any new information. We will continue any discussions that we're having and answer any new questions, but no new slides, no new information. Everything is perfect. When I put dates below a person, if it's below a political figure, it's their tenure in office. And if it's for a philosopher or a thought leader, it's their lifespan. And this, like the other 59 entities in the Middle Eastern and North African history series, as well as all of the other series that we do at History Mostly Ancient Discussions, can be seen at our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps the algorithm, and then more people can see our content. And also, this is given completely freely, but YouTube Premium, Meetup, Zoom, Advanced, these services all cost money. And so please help us if you feel that the content has been helpful, interesting, and you appreciate what it is that we do here. All right. So we've talked a lot in our previous discussions about World War I, and we're almost past it. We're almost past it, guys. But if you remember, World War I and World War II have a fundamental distinction when it comes to the Middle East. And that fundamental distinction is that in World War I, one of the major powers in the Central Powers was a Middle Eastern state. That's the Ottoman Empire, right? You have this country that occupies what is today about 10 different countries region, in whole or in part. And that country has 5 different fronts that it's fighting on. And so the Middle East is part and parcel of the actions of the war. Now, we discussed how the Ottoman Empire was reticent to be involved, and we discussed how the Ottoman Empire was a smaller power in terms of population relative to the European states, right? Most of the European states had around 50 to 60 million people, and the Ottoman Empire had around 20 million. But there's a fundamental difference about what's happening now in World War II than what was happening in World War I. And that is that we don't have a powerful Middle Eastern state that is involved in the war. On the Allied side, right, we have the United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Of course, these enter at different points in the war. And on the Axis side, we have the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, and a number of smaller states, most of them in Southern or Eastern Europe. So it's important to realize that the Middle East is no longer a center of gravity for the war. It certainly occurs in the Middle East, and we're going to talk about all the ways that it does. But it is almost always as a sideshow, not as the main show. And that's even to a greater extent than it was during World War I. Another thing I want to point out here is that these borders in the Middle East look suspiciously familiar to most of us, because these are more or less the borders that exist today. There are some exceptions, right? Morocco has a Spanish enclave in the north, which should actually be the same color as Spain. There is one Palestine mandate as opposed to 2 or 3 countries, depending on how you like to divide it today. Syria and Lebanon are one unit. And Kuwait is not yet independent. And at the same token, North and South Yemen are 2 distinct countries. But by and large, this looks relatively familiar, much more so than that map of World War I. And this presentation is going to assume a basic level of understanding with regards to the conflict, its purpose, and for example, Germany's avenging of the Treaty of Versailles, many of the other serious issues. And so we're going to focus on what happened in the Middle East. So a couple people that I wanted to sort of bring about and talk about, we have Nouri al-Said, the Prime Minister of Iraq. We're going to talk about him in the Iraqi section. We're going to see Franz von Papen, who was a German emissary and diplomat who was operating in Istanbul and Ankara in the Turkish Republic. And you have Marshal Pétain, who was a leader of what would become what called Vichy France, the Nazi-aligned state in the south of France after France surrendered in June of 1940. So in order to get us to World War II, we need to understand a little bit about where Turkey was in the lead up to this moment. So you have a personality cult surrounding the person of Atatürk. And Atatürk had managed to forge from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And we talked about how that happened over the course of several episodes, episode 47, episode 48A, episode 50, how he created this Turkish Republic. And for the 15 years of his presidency, from 1923 to 1938, he really remolded the state in his image to such a point where he effectively became the visual representative of the state. And the question really became, who would succeed Atatürk? Who could take on that mantle? And while nobody could do it in the fullest sense of that term, a lot of people believed that İsmet İnönü, who had served alongside Atatürk and really believed in a lot of his messages from the very beginning, should be that person. İnönü had a long history. He fought, for example, in the Turkish War of Independence that we covered in episodes 47 and 48. He was also involved in the negotiation of Treaty of Lausanne, which was the treaty that created the modern Turkey with its modern borders. He served as prime minister in several of Atatürk's administrations. You can see him there on the 10th anniversary of the Declaration of the Republic with Atatürk. He was also involved in some of the darker elements of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's reign, such as the suppression of the Sheikh Zayed revolt in 1924, which was a Kurdish revolt against the increasing secularism and increasing Turkism of the Turkish state. And that's something that we're going to come back to, is how the CHP, or the Republican People's Party, that's what that acronym stands for, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, or Republican People's Party, that this party has at its root this idea of national identity, which is a Turco-Muslim identity, but it is a secular republic. And so those who are opposed to the secularism or opposed to the Turkish identification of the republic, of which Sheikh Zayed was both, ended up trying to rebel against that state. And throughout Atatürk's governance, he had to put down several of those revolts. İnönü was inextricably tied with that history. He was also involved with the debate that we discussed in episode 58 concerning the division of northern Iraq, that northern Iraq would go to the British. It wasn't at all clear in 1919 that Mosul and the area around Mosul would be British. But given the amount of oil there, the British Lord Curzon made sure to have that happen. This was actually one of the first issues that was debated at the League of Nations, where the Turks and the British submitted proposals concerning who would be able to own Mosul. And the British actually lost at the League of Nations. So, of course, in typical British fashion, they decided that if they couldn't get the result that they wanted through diplomatic means, they were going to assert it militarily. And Turkey at that point could not contest Britain's ability to control the region. And so they made a deal concerning the profit sharing on the oil. Another aspect of Ataturk's reign in his 15 years was that he sought to make peace with all of the neighbors of Turkey. And so he, for example, he created the Balkan Pact of 1934 because of the possibility of Bulgarian expansionism and aggression. He signed the Sa'adabad Pact with Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan that would try to defend all of those countries from attack. He tried to maintain relations with other populations that were being expelled. Remember, in the 1930s, when Ataturk was in the middle of his reign, was actually the beginning of Nazi Germany. And so Ataturk actually sent requests for Jewish scientists from Germany to come to Turkey in order to help both start the university education system that was burgeoning in Turkey at the time, as well as finding a home where they could live in peace. So you can see Einstein's letter where Einstein thanks Ataturk for providing all these Jewish scientists with an opportunity to survive and thrive when they couldn't do that in their native homeland. But because of İnönü's connection to Ataturk and his consistent presence alongside that great leader, when Ataturk died at the end of 1938, it was pretty much assumed that İnönü would be his successor. And in fact, he was approved with a unanimous vote of the Grand National Assembly, or the Turkish Parliament. Now, there's one other thing that we should talk about when it comes to his time under Ataturk, and this will play a huge role in World War II. And this is his negotiation of what are called the Montreux Convention of 1936. It was negotiated in the Swiss town of Montreux. And this is a convention over how the Bosporus Straits and the Straits of Marmara, which are the entry point between the Mediterranean and Aegean sides, on one part, and the Black Sea on the other part. These conventions gave Turkey an incredible amount of control over who could enter or leave through the Bosporus Straits. And after they were signed in 1936, it allowed Turkey to arm and organize a military development along these Turkish straits. This meant that during peacetime, ships could come and go as they pleased, but during wartime, the Turkish government could close the straits and prevent countries from moving their militaries in or out. We're going to see that the various parties are going to try and curry favor with Turkey specifically to open up that access, because the Turkish straits are the only way that any Soviet fleet that is launched from their war mortar ports on the Black Sea can reach the Mediterranean. And conversely, when the Nazis and the Italians are going to want to bombard the southern parts of Russia and use a naval attack to accompany their land attacks, they can't do it specifically because the straits are closed to them. But once he becomes the president of Turkey, he tries to form his own government. And he works with other members of the CHP, like Celal Bayar, who you can see there. Celal was his prime minister for about 10 months to a year, but they had a falling out over the way that İnönü wanted to run the economy. Ataturk, when he was in power, instituted what was called devletçilik, or state capitalism, where the state actually is the mastermind behind the large-scale investment in industry development and technology. In fact, because Ataturk and İnönü did this, industry in Turkey grew at an incredibly fast pace. For a modern equivalent of this policy, you can actually look at China since 1980 until about 2010, when the government did a lot of the same kinds of activities. You had a colossal growth in business. Celal Bayar wanted to create a more capitalistic system, a more private ownership system, and İnönü was opposed to this. And so he removed Bayar from the prime ministry, and he also proceeded to remove any members of the CHP except those who would agree with him. Furthermore, he weakened the power of the Grand National Assembly and acquired more and more power to himself. So even though Atatürk is very famous for having been this strong, charismatic force of nature, Atatürk in many respects actually worked within a system where a parliament was responsive to him. İnönü was actually more of a one-person state. And I have a comment here that Franco also managed that kind of state capitalistic system. That's absolutely correct. After World War II, that was exactly the economy that Franco pivoted to. But İnönü, in creating this one-party state, effectively made all of his decisions the decisions of the country. And we're going to see how that centralization will affect Turkey after the war in 2023. One of the other decisions that İnönü made was that he appointed lifelong bureaucrat Hasan Ali Yücel to be the Minister of Education. And Yücel in particular was a person who was not a political person. He had no political allegiances. And so he was able to continually rise and develop in İnönü's administration. In particular, he is most famous for the creation of what were called the village institutes. There had been a huge inequality in education in Turkey between the city elites and the rural population. And what Yücel was able to do with these village institutes was sort of begin to level out the playing field and make it more possible for poor villagers to assimilate to the Turkish way of life. And by that, we mean that sort of secularized, modernized version of life. Illiteracy decreased tremendously under İnönü's administration. And he began to inculcate his own cult of personality a little less successfully than Atatürk did, calling himself the Milli Chef, or the national chief, because of all of the business and educational progress he was making in the country. One of the other foreign policy issues, and we've talked about this before in episode 50 and when we talked about it from the Turkish side, and episode 54 when we talked about it from the Syrian side, which was the expansion into Alexandretta, the region the Turkish called Hatay. This was a region where Turks were the largest single ethnic group, but if you add up the various different ethno-religious components of Arabs, such as the Alawites, the Sunni Arabs, the Melkites, Greek and other Christians who would identify as Arabs, there were more Arabs in the region than Turks. But since Turks were 39% of the population in the French census conducted in 1936, the Turks were able to angle that this should be a part of Turkey. And Atatürk, before he died, was preparing to launch a military assault to take the region and bring it into Turkey. But it was İnönü who actually did the act after Atatürk died. And you can see those forces marching in Alexandretta. Now, the French were, of course, the colonial administrators of Syria. And so this presented a direct challenge to them and their ability to maintain order. It also presented a direct challenge to the treaties that France had signed with Atatürk in 1921, which guaranteed the border between Syria in the south and Turkey in the north. That said, the French were mightily afraid of Nazism, and they considered the strategic position that Turkey now occupied. For them, it was more important, especially as we're going to see from the position of René Massigli, who was the French ambassador to Turkey, that that border was less important than maintaining a positive Turkish-French relationship, that Hatay was an acceptable loss, and Hatay was annexed by Turkey. It's worth pointing out that almost all of the non-Turkish population, including non-Arabs, like Circassians, like Armenians, were extremely opposed to this Turkish annexation, especially the Armenians. Many of them and the Arabs fled the province as soon as it came under Turkish control, fearing, especially the Armenians, fearing a replication of the genocide of 1915 to 1919. So as we move into İnönü's administration, we begin to see the actions that would lead to the Second World War, right? Because Ataturk dies in 1938, 1939 is when the Second World War begins. So there's not a lot of lead up here. We start to see a Turkish foreign policy, which is oriented in a very strange way relative to Turkey's history. As we've discussed in our series, Turkey has had a long antipathy towards Russia. They've gone to war on 12 different occasions from the 1580s until World War I. But following World War I, the Soviet Union and the Republic of Turkey actually established a new relationship with each other. And it had been the Soviet Union that had been the primary trade partner of the early Turkish Republic. It had also been an early military supporter of the Turkish Republic. And so in the constellation of defense as contemplated by Şükrü Saraçoğlu, who was the foreign minister and then later became the prime minister in 1942 of Turkey under İnönü's presidency, what would be necessary would be to remain in a strong relationship, an almost alliance-like relationship with the Soviet Union. So when the British ambassador Knatchbull Hugesson and the French ambassador Massigli approached him, he was only willing to accept a Franco-British alliance in the context of an alliance with the Soviet Union as well. In the idea of Turkey, that needed to have occurred. And you can see, for example, the beginning of that relationship between Turkey and the Soviet Union in that picture of the Treaty of Moscow, when the Bolsheviks, who were not yet in power, recognized the government of the Republic of Turkey, which was itself also not in power. But this was completely confused when the Soviets signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And therefore, it became clear that the Soviets were going to favor the opposing side, the German side, in the war. That said, the British and French ended up getting the Turks to sign the tripartite agreement. And this tripartite agreement ultimately led to Turkey, at least initially, saying that it would be on the Allied side. That, however, was not something that İnönü wanted to feel beholden to, especially because war had now broken out. And he used the terms of the tripartite agreement to effectively stay neutral, pro-Allied, but neutral. But he wouldn't be able to stay in that camp for a very long time. Franz von Papen, who was the German ambassador in Istanbul, began speaking to the Turkish leadership. Now, the British and French had demanded that Turkey, as an ally, expel all German representatives. The Turks did not do this. And von Papen made it clear that Turkey had a much better position in the Axis world than with the British and the French. And when the Nazis were able to defeat the French in June of 1940, you can see there the Nazis are in Paris, it became increasingly clear that the Germans were at least in a good point to win the war. Another thing that was revealed when France fell is that René Massigli and a number of other French had been coordinating what was called Operation Pike, which was an attempt to fly from Syria or from Iraq, which were French and British mandates respectively, over Turkish airspace and possibly Iranian airspace in order to bomb the city of Baku in the Soviet Union. During the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that from 1939 until 1941, the Soviet Union was actually supplying Nazi Germany with oil, which it desperately needed. And so the Allies felt that if they could bomb Baku, which was responsible for 70% of Soviet oil production, they could prevent the Germans from having that advantage. Now, Saracoğlu had effectively given the Allies tacit permission to fly over Turkish airspace. And these documents were recorded in Paris. So when the Nazis took over Paris, they released all of these documents. And this caused public outrage in the streets. The idea that the British and French could assume that they could fly so easily over Turkish airspace. And because of this and the increasing pressure on Turkey's government from its people, you ended up having what was the signing of the German-Turkish Treaty of Friendship. Now, again, while the tripartite agreement, which was now a dead letter that was signed in October of 1939, didn't really compel Turkey to actually fight on the side of the Allies. In the same way, this German-Turkish Treaty of Friendship did not compel Turkey to fight on the side of the Axis, only to maintain a good relationship. And that relationship was based on the exportation of chromite. There's a point that 30% of German fuel while they were marching on Paris was provided by the Soviets. That's absolutely correct. So the way that the Germans structured their relationship with Turkey was on this chromite exchange. Chromite is a relatively plentiful ore from which chrome can be extracted. And again, this is a resource of which Germany had very little and desperately needed significant quantities. So following the Clodius Agreement, which was an instantiation of how the German-Turkish treaties economic relationship would continue, Turkey would provide chromite, and in turn, Germany would provide railroads. They would help build trains throughout Turkey. They would also provide old technology that was still functional to the Turkish Republic. That said, the relationship with Nazi Germany never really got further than these kinds of agreements, very similar to the kinds of agreements that Sweden had made with Nazi Germany, or Switzerland made with Nazi Germany, in order to remain neutral and unoccupied. But at the same time, they were facilitating the resource extraction needs of the Nazi Empire. That said, it's very important to notice that İnönü did not take the bait, for want of a better term, of helping the Axis in two cases where they specifically requested Turkish assistance. The first case is that of Greece. When the Nazis were invading Greece from the north, they requested that Turkey assist by invading Greece from the east. Now, considering that the Turkish War of Independence, fought only less than 20 years prior, had been directly against the Hellenic Republic, against Greece, and there was a lot of antipathy towards Greece within Turkey, the fact that İnönü held his head high and refused to go to war against the Greeks, in honoring to a strong extent the Balkan Pact that Atatürk had made in 1934, really shows the evolution of the Turkish political process at this point. The other country that Turkey was asked to help with was Iraq. As we're going to discuss, and as we have discussed in episode 58, Iraq had its own fascist revolution, or coup d'etat, in April of 1941. And in order for the Germans to have direct access to Iraq, they would need either access by train or access by ship. And the easiest way would be overland across Turkey. There were already train lines that had been built during the Ottoman period that linked Istanbul to Baghdad. The Turks again refused to allow Nazi soldiers to come through their territory, and so the only assistance the Germans were able to provide the Iraqis was air support. The Iraqi coup d'etat was undone by the British 2 months after it had started. There's another point that's worth making, which is that in order to become a state that would become part of the United Nations, at some point you had to declare war on Nazi Germany. And so the Turks declared war in February of 1945, when it was incredibly clear that the Allies were going to win. But it was, for want of a better term, a phony war. The Turks never sent soldiers to fight any German soldiers. There are no war casualties from soldiers of the Turkish Republic fighting against the Nazis in World War II. But because they had declared war in February of 1945, they were invited to San Francisco when the League of Nations was brought into existence. Now, it's important to talk about other domestic policies that occurred during the World War II period within Turkey. Probably the biggest and strangest one is the treatment of the Jewish people within Turkey. Now, German Jewish scientists, as I said, had been brought in 1933. The Nazis, led by von Papen, had requested that discriminatory laws be imposed on the Jews of Turkey, and to the extent, with the exception of the Varlık-Vergisi, which we're going to talk about in a second, there were no discriminatory laws placed on Jews within the Turkish Republic. There was no requirement to wear yellow stars. There was no internment. In fact, a number of Jewish and Zionist organizations, one of those Zionist organizations being the Jewish Agency for Israel, coordinated a lot of their efforts from Istanbul because it was the closest place to occupied Europe where Jews could still operate freely. There were a number of attempts to get ships and other cargo, mostly human cargo, out of occupied Europe from Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust there. And those would come through Turkey, through the Straits. There was also coordination from the Jewish communities within Turkey to try and facilitate possible rehabilitation or further on-roads to mandatory Palestine or the United States. There's also the important story of Selahattin Ülkümen, who's the only Turkish citizen recognized, as far as I'm aware, by Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations. He was a consul to Rhodes. Rhodes was part of Italy at this point. Italy controlled the Dodecanese Islands, which are now part of Greece. And he was the consul there. And he argued that of the 2,000 Jews who were living on the island, about 600 or so were either Turkish citizens or married to Turkish citizens, and therefore should be respected as Turkish citizens and not taken for deportation. The ones who were not protected by him absolutely were taken for deportation. Almost all of them were gassed in Auschwitz. But those that he protected were able eventually to get to Turkey. Selahattin Ülkümen was not able to avoid recrimination for his act. He was jailed and tortured by the Nazis, and his suffering is part of why he's been recognized as a righteous among the nations. He did survive the war, and he lived in Turkey until the 1970s afterwards. Now, the Varlık-Vergisi is the other part of this domestic situation. In 1943, under Shukru Saracoğlu as prime minister, you had a situation where ostensibly the government was passing a tax in order to collect revenue to support a Turkish military should Turkey have to enter the war, and to put Turkey in a much better position. That said, the way this tax was applied was so uneven and so reprehensible in terms of its actual organization that it was quite clear to those to whom it was applied that it was done as a tax against non-Muslims, specifically because Greeks, Armenians, and Jews had a disproportionately large share of the Ottoman economy before 1914, and even in the Turkish Republic were still among a disproportionate share of the wealthiest entrepreneurs and business people in the Republic of Turkey. And so those numbers are not an error. Those are percentages of the wealth of the family that was taxed. So you can see Muslims were taxed at just under 5%. Greeks were taxed at 156% of their wealth. Jews were taxed at 179% of their wealth. And Armenians were taxed at 232% of their wealth, which effectively bankrupted entire families. You can see families selling priceless heirlooms. They had 1 month to pay the taxes. And the law was not rescinded until March of 1944, when Turkey was trying to curry favor with the Allies, and the British and the Americans made it incredibly clear that such a taxation mechanism would not be acceptable. Furthermore, during that period from 11th of November 1942 until the 15th of March 1944, when the Varlık-Vergisi was being employed, those who were unable to pay and demonstrated no willingness to pay, as perceived by the Turkish government, were sent to Ashkale, which is a town in the Taurus Mountains, deep in the heart of Anatolia, where a labor camp was constructed, and they were put to incredibly hard labor. You can see those are people who would be who would be taken by the train to Ashkelon. Some people were in that camp for as long as 13 months. Most stayed there for less time because they didn't start sending people to the camps until a little bit later. But the people sent to the camps were primarily Christian, although there were some Jews who were also sent to the camps. There's a question of why would people not pretend to be Muslims in order to not pay the tax? There are different reasons, primarily because it was very easy for people to know what family somebody came from. And a conversion that occurred in 1942 would not have been seen as genuine. Another reason was that many people were proud of their families and their histories. And they also believed genuinely in religion, that the religion of their birth was the way that they would achieve life after death. And so for them, suffering in this world was not the same as suffering in the next. Another part of the domestic Turkish world, which happened in 1944, were what were called the racism-Turanism trials. And this was a sort of interesting departure within Turkish society. One of the things that we discussed when we talked about Turkism, Turkification, all of these things in the first half of the 20th century is that there was this idea of Turanism, this idea that it's not just the people of the country of Turkey today who are the Turks. The Turks are all speakers of Turkish languages. And so you can see this map on the upper right-hand side of this great Turanic republic, this great Turan nation, all of the different Turkic peoples. And some of the peoples who are considered Turkic on this map wouldn't even consider themselves Turkic. People like the Kurds, or people like Persians, people like Mazandaranis. But in this idea, Turkey was naturally expansionist. Now, you can imagine when courting the Allies in the beginning of 1944, especially the Soviet Union, the idea of supporting a racial identified nationalism would be very unpalatable because of its connections to Nazi Germany. And at the same time, as you can see, a significant portion of the territory of the Great Turan Nation is territory controlled by the Soviet Union. So İnönü and his government started attacking individuals who were the strongest acolytes of Turanism ideology. Now, it should be made clear that while these people may have, quote, despicable views, end quote, they were not violent, right? They had simply expressed these views and had campaigned on them. In particular, you have Nihal Atsız, who was very pro-German. He saw that the Germans had embraced a racial hierarchy. He agreed with that. And he also agreed with the fact that they were anti-communist. He was virulently anti-communist. And so he agreed with that. Nihal Atsız and a number of other Turanists were first imprisoned and tortured. They were jailed in these very small storage cabinets called, in Turkish, tabutluk. You can see the size of the containers. There are numerous different documents which record the human rights abuses to which they were subjected and torture. And the Turkish Republic, they sentenced them to trials. Interestingly, during their trials, a number of them made the argument, which I think is actually quite credible, which is that the Turkish government itself was actually supportive of many of the racist views that they had. These ideas of Turkish supremacy, these ideas of Turkish uniqueness. There were offices, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, offices in the Turkish Republic that could not be held by a non-Muslim, a non-Turk. And so they said that the Turkish Republic itself was operating under many of the ideals that they held. They just took it one step further. There were other arguments that they hadn't actually done anything criminal, that they hadn't that aside from convincing people of their policies, they had actually not done anything. Regardless, they were found guilty. Most of them were imprisoned for several years. Their sentences were eventually commuted after the war. especially when Turkey was moving towards a pro-American perspective in the Cold War, and no longer needed to appease the Soviet Union, which was really the country that was most angered by the presence of these Turanists in Turkey. And in particular, the Soviet Union's claims on territory that Turkey possessed, as you can see in that map, after World War II, led more antipathy in Turkey towards the Soviet Union. All right, so now that we've seen World War II from the perspective of Turkey, we're going to shift a little bit, and we're going to talk about North Africa. The North Africa campaign sort of splits into two major components. The first component is the Italian invasion of Northern Africa, which is in 1940 and sort of peters out when the British defeat it towards the end of that year. And the second part is when the Germans invade in 1941, and that doesn't peter out until 1943, with most of the major battles occurring in 1942. One of the most important and recurring parts in both the Italian period and the German period, if we can call it that, is the Siege of Malta. Now you can see from the map that Malta is in this very strange position. It's south of Italy in the Mediterranean, and it had been a British possession for several decades at this point. And on Malta, they speak a dialect of Arabic, which they have codified as their own language, Maltese. But despite that, they are Roman Catholic and were very loyal to the British government. And accordingly, they were dubbed by Churchill as an unsinkable aircraft carrier because of how many planes could be launched from Malta directly at Axis locations. Because of this, Malta was bombed severely by both German and Italian planes based in Sicily. And it wouldn't be until the middle of 1942, when the battles in Africa shifted their focus, that Malta would be left alone. In particular, Malta is known for the convoys of British ships that were used to bring supplies to the island, to both allow the island to resist from a military perspective, but also to resist from a civilian perspective. So you have Operation Halberd, for example. You can see that those convoys of warships protecting the merchant marine that would bring goods from the United Kingdom all the way through the Straits of Gibraltar to Malta. And you can see the SS Ohio, which is a U.S. tanker. It was captained, however, by the British, that brought significant amounts of petroleum to the island in Operation Pedestal. The ship was badly damaged, but it was still drivable and was able to bring petroleum to the battle-fatigued island in order to restart their bombing campaigns. We also have, if we look at the Italian period in the upper left-hand corner, right, we have those Italian invasions up to Sidi Barrani, which is in Egypt. And we'll talk about that when we look more at the Egyptian side. But the Italians were pushed back almost as quickly as they came in. The British were able to push them back all the way to territories in the middle of what is now of Libya. But the British relocated those forces before they could completely remove the Italian presence from Libya. And of course, sending those troops to Greece did practically nothing, because Greece fell very quickly to the Nazis. But it meant that the Axis still had the ability to make landfall, and eventually, in late 1941, the German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, was able to take advantage of that and then push the British back even further into Egypt, all the way to Alamein. And then starting in 1943, the Allies ended up pushing back all the way to Tunis.
Yeah, I think I just want to say something about the English pushing the Italians. I think the English were outnumbered something like 4 or 5 to 1 at the beginning.
Yeah.
They only had 60,000 men, and the British commander did not want to send his troops to Greece. That was against his wishes.
Right.
Yeah, but the Italians were so inept that they could only push the British when the Germans landed in Libya.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely correct. It's almost hilarious how few people the British had in terms of how they were able to just rout the Italians battle after battle.
Yeah, and the same thing happened in Albania. Like the Italians were having a tough time, and then the Germans arrived, and then it was over within a matter of months.
No, to defend the Italians a little bit, because nobody does. One, it wasn't the Italian military who wanted to attack the British. It was Mussolini who was pushing them. And your generic Italian soldier had absolutely no interest in attacking British Egypt. They wanted no part of the war. They'd had a bitter taste after World War I. They had a lot of dead and casualties and didn't get much out of it as far as they were concerned. The last thing they wanted to do is go empire building for Mussolini's glory. And also the fact that their industry was woefully small compared to everyone else. They didn't have the capacity to fight that fight, which in World War II was very much of an industrial war.
Speaking of the people who could fight that fight, Mark, can you give a little color on the battles of Alamein?
Well, the two battles, the first one, basically, to say it succinctly, the first battle of Alamein stopped Rommel. The second one pushed him back. And in between, Montgomery was able to amass a huge amount of supplies, ammunition, American tanks, a lot of American supplies, where by the time he attacked in the second Battle of Alamein, he had a crushing superiority in airplanes and tanks and artillery and such, and infantry, that the Germans really stood no chance. And that's one of the things that it was characteristic of Montgomery and people will analyze his psychology. He was an officer in World War I. And I don't remember what battles he was in, but he was quite psychologically marked by the battles of the Somme and Passchendaele and such, with the huge casualties that the British had taken. He was quite cognizant that the British couldn't do that a second time. So his idea was amass your supplies, get a crushing superiority, then attack, which is not a stupid thing. I mean, Sun Tzu said the same thing, but it was a critique of the Americans that he was too cautious.
In the comments also, we have a defense of the Italians, saying that Rommel thought that the Italians actually fought rather well. It's that their generals didn't lead them properly.
That's true.
Speaking of bad tactics, Hadrian, would you like to tell us a little about Operation Bertram, which is a key part of the battles of El Alamein?
Yeah, I was very interested in this because it's a lot of people know about Operation Fortitude, which is when the Allies used fake radio traffic and fake paratroopers and fake army, the first US Corps, US Army that was based in Kent. That was a completely fabricated fake army led by Patton, supposedly, and was supposed to land in the Pas-de-Calais region in France. And so this is another one of these operations. And one thing that I was trying to answer when I did the research on this is why is it that the Germans never did this? As far as I know, they never did any operation large scale like this where they would hide their tanks or create fake radio traffic or plant false information. I don't know if they did, but
yeah, I was going to say we should probably clarify. Operation Bertram was an operation where the British created an entire fake army by building tanks, like you can see, out of wire and mesh and putting covers over them. So the Germans actually thought that they had stationed troops in a place where they hadn't actually stationed troops.
Yeah, it was actually very clever. So they had, basically, there's not that many places where you can push on El Alamein because apparently the Qattara Depression, for some reason, is impassable.
Yeah, and imagine it's like a gigantic lake without a water.
Yeah,
So-
it's supposed to be like a salt bed. I don't know why it's
No,
impassable.
it is a
I
salt
think-
bed, but it's a salt, like it looks almost like a lake bed. But so it has those like, it's sort of like a steep ravine in. You can't use a tank over it because it's not flat. It's actually a depression.
Like, yeah, but your tank would be able to roll on the depression part of it, right? On the flat bed, I imagine, right?
Maybe, I don't know.
Apparently not.
Um,
It was a barrier. It did serve a funneling effect for that really helped the British funnel or shorten their lines so that they could be strong enough. And it's no accident that that's where the British stopped the Germans at that thin part between the Qattara Depression and the Mediterranean.
Yes, I mean, what I understood, I think from the photographs is that the reason why the battle line was so short was because if you were to put people in the Qattara Depression, they had absolutely no cover on a flat terrain, surrounded on all sides by like higher up positions. So I think it would have been suicide anyway to put people there, but I didn't know if it was actually like impossible to drive there with a tank or not, but anyway, so essentially because of the Qattara Depression, there were only like two places where the British could actually strike. The most obvious one is the one where the railroad is, which is north, which is where they actually attacked. And then they created this deception operation to make it seem like they would be attacking from the south. And what they did is they had essentially the Germans believing that their attack would be on the south and also that it would be 2 days late. So what they did is they put tanks far away from the front, about 2 days drive away from the front. And much closer to the front, they put trucks. And then during the night, they basically swapped the tanks and the trucks one with the other. And then when they attacked, it seemed from the Germans' point of view that the tanks were still 2 days behind the front line, but they were actually right at the front line ready to attack. And they also they created a fake water pipe with fake pumping stations, and they were building it at a rate of about like 5 miles a day. And it was pointing towards the south. So from the Germans' point of view, it looked like the pipeline was necessary to support the attack, but it was actually completely fake. And another thing the English did that was really amazing and impressive is they created a fake army in the north. So they had in the north, they basically they put like artillery pieces that were camouflaged, and then they let the sand and the sandstorms come over and mess up the camouflage. And on purpose, they did not repair the camouflage in order to let the Germans think that they found basically that that there were some artillery positions at this spot that were camouflaged. And essentially the Germans attacked thinking that they were fakes, but they turned out to be real because they were swapped the night before. So I'm not sure if I explained that correctly, but basically like the Germans thought they had discovered a slip up that was actually made on purpose. So honestly, this was kind of unnecessary anyway, because the British, as Mark said, they had a 2-1 advantage at this point in the war, and Rommel kept asking for more supplies. But of course, as with as we know, the Germans didn't have the industrial capacity to push on all fronts at this point in the war, and they had to prioritize the USSR front. And basically, Rommel's only hope was to sustain the attack, and hopefully the army in Stalingrad would come down, would basically succeed and then come down in Iran and then force the British to divert their troops. So that's why he was entrenching himself in Alamein. And he had put millions of mines. He was in a very strong fortified position. But it wasn't enough in the end.
Now we have a
If I could,
question.
go ahead with the question.
Yeah, we have a question. So is this common that the British are, familiar with this kind of chicanery, and why is it the British are the ones who are using it as opposed to other parties in the war?
Oh yeah,
They're
I was
good at
interested
it.
in this. Yeah, it seemed so. Basically, one thing I discovered is, first of all, the quality of the British officers was extremely high. For instance, George Barkas, I think, who was in charge of the camouflage operation in the Middle East, he was actually a former film director that was hired specifically in the camouflage unit, and he was very good at his job. He was also able to evangelize essentially his camouflage ideas by printing very famous, widely circulated pamphlets that convinced many people. And that's why he was eventually basically commissioned to do this. And he had with him a team of very unconventional people. He had like actual artists and like people that in civilian life were very good at art and drawing and sculpting. And I don't know if the German army would have been able to do this, but one thing that is not mentioned, if you go on the Wikipedia page for this, is that obviously one obvious reason why the British were able to do this and not the Germans is, of course, that in July 1941, so this battle happens in October, November, but in July, the British already have the codes for the Enigma machine. So essentially, if the Germans had tried to do this, it would have completely failed because the British would have known, just based on their decrypting the German plans, they would have known that this would have been fake. But the British, because they have the German codes, they can both deceive them and read their communications to make sure that the deception is working. So it's very powerful. If obviously, if you know what the enemy is saying, you can leak information much more efficiently. Yeah, and so they had multiple models of this, which is very impressive because they had a coalition on the British side. So they had material of many different armies. They had some Australians and French people fighting for them. So they had to tailor this to multiple models of tanks. And for instance, they also had a version where they had an artillery piece hidden inside the truck. So it would look like a truck, which is like a worthless target to bomb. But in fact, it's an artillery piece. And as soon as the battle starts, the camouflage goes off and it starts firing on your positions. And so they were able to put these trucks very, very close to the German lines and surprise them.
Wow, fantastic. So
if I could add one thing about that, the Battle of El Alamein is that the British superiority wasn't just in the materiel, it was also in gasoline and fuel. And water for that matter. By the time the Second Battle of Alamein came about, Rommel had been starved of gasoline for many months. The British had got an upper hand on the southern Mediterranean and were able to interdict tankers, fuel tankers from Italy to Libya. And after a while, they were interdicting almost all of it. So not only did Montgomery have that superiority, but he was also much more mobile. And if you're being attacked and you can't shift your forces from one place to another when you don't know when where the real attack is occurring, you're at a serious disadvantage.
Agreed.
Yes.
All right, so now we're going to shift to the other side of North Africa. We're going to talk about Operation Torch. Now, at the very beginning of the war, when France fell in 1940, there was the attack of what's called Mersa Kebir, which is when the French had their naval facilities along the coast of what is today Algeria, and they were bombed by the British to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Vichy French, who were led by Francois Darlan. You can see Darlan at the bottom of the screen. And so you enter this point where we're at the beginning of we're in 1942. The United States have primarily spent their time in 1942 attacking the Japanese in the Pacific, but they want to be involved in the war in Europe. And there's a discussion between the British and the Americans concerning where the Americans should first encounter German soldiers. Mark, you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, that gets into a very complicated aspect that gets a bit short shrift in the analysis post-war, because people tend to think of history of having played out the only way it could have played out, and that everything was hunky-dory between the Allies and everything. But from the beginning, the Americans and the British argued over where to attack and when. This Operation Torch, at first the Americans wanted to send those troops directly into France, as in a D-Day, 2 years before it was going to happen. In the end, and the British were quite aghast at that, because those American soldiers would have been probably just massacred by the Germans eventually and then ground down. There was a good deal of conflict between the Americans and the British about how to conduct the war, or specifically what theater to emphasize. The British, it was all about the Mediterranean, and they said, yeah, eventually we'll do Overlord in northern France, but first we need the Mediterranean. And the Americans reluctantly went with it, but the British kept going at it. There was the British who pushed for Sicily and for Italy. Later on, Churchill, kind of by himself, was pushing for a more aggressive Mediterranean strategy, even after southern Italy had been invaded. He was pushing for Dalmatian islands to be taken. He wanted Greek islands like Rhodes, Leros, because of its deep water port, to be taken. And the Americans balked at that. They said, basically, the Americans were suspicious that Churchill was up to some call it neo-colonialist war aims.
Yeah.
And in fact, Churchill actually visited Turkey, and he met with İnönü on a train in southern Turkey somewhere, trying to convince them to go on the Ally side. And İnönü was kind of leaning towards that until he met with von Papen, and von Papen was able to bluff the Turks into thinking that the Germans had quite a few troops in southern Bulgaria, and that if they ever dared attack, well, they would just be crushed. And when it turns out they didn't have those troops, but İnönü believed them, played the cautious card, and didn't go in. But the whole idea that what Churchill wanted was to get Turkey on the Allied side and get Turkish permission this time, as opposed to 20 years before in the Dardanelles, Turkish permission to send an Allied fleet into the Black Sea and support Russia directly through the Black Sea, instead of going through Murmansk and through Iran.
Absolutely.
That was part of it anyway. And the Americans just didn't go for it and said, okay, you want to do it, you do it alone. And the British did. They attacked a number of the islands, particularly when it was a rather auspicious moment when the Italians had surrendered. And the Italians had a few of these very strategic islands, and the British tried to take over from the Italians and convince the Italians to surrender to them and not the Germans. But it didn't work out. The Germans played their card very well. They used their resources very well. The British didn't put in enough resources, and the Germans won, and that stopped that whole strategy. And eventually the British, caved, but eventually agreed to put a lot of the needed resources, particularly shipping was a big constraint, to Overlord, which was the invasion of Normandy. But for a couple of years there, it was a constant argument between the two sides.
Absolutely. And I think that gives a lot of context for why you have all these Americans in what look like D-Day boats almost, going to Oran in what's today Algeria. You can also see the landfall at Algiers. And in terms of the landfall in Algeria, in both Algiers and in Oran. These were relatively straightforward. The American troops got out, the Vichy French fired on them, but the resistance was relatively light. On the Moroccan side, the Western Task Force, you had a number of Vichy French resistors, especially in the area around what's today Casablanca. You can see those are Americans hunkered down between Fedela and Casablanca. But eventually, when François D'Hollande surrendered to the Allies, it effectively secured the the British and American position, as well as what would become the Free French position in those territories. Now, of course, there was a lot of consternation by both the Free French and a number of the Allies that D'Hollande was allowed to maintain his post after he surrendered to the Allies and maintain control. Do any of our panelists want to talk about that?
Yeah, the D'Hollande was a favorite of the Western Allies. He got along well, although the only reason he was in North Africa was because his son had taken ill, and D'Hollande had went to visit him. And as a bit of a background about D'Hollande, he was part of the, obviously the French Navy. The French Navy was closely linked to France's colonies, which meant they saw Brits or the English as very much of a competitor, almost as much as the Germans. So D'Hollande was rather Anglophobe. The attacks that Richard had mentioned at Mer and Kébir and Oran didn't help any either. But he was he saw the political winds changing. Just as a note, D'Hollande also fought in artillery. He commanded a naval gun in Verdun. So he was certainly no friend of the Germans either. But once he was in that, he basically was captured by the Americans. The Allies liked him. Neither Roosevelt nor Churchill liked de Gaulle at all. De Gaulle was very prickly. He didn't have shall we say, an engaging personality. He totally mistrusted the Americans and the British for very good reasons many times. But the Allies they preferred D'Hollande, and he had status. He was a high figure in the Vichy regime, where de Gaulle was nothing. He had been a colonel just before the war. He was only barely promoted general, I think, in 1940 or just before. But he was D'Hollande had the unfortunate fate of being assassinated by a royalist. It wasn't too far. Maybe it was early 43 or something like that. So he played no role in later politics.
Absolutely. And so one of the issues in terms of that operation of landing on the west coast of Africa, Morocco and Algeria, but why not Tunisia? Tunisia was too close to areas where Italians could bomb, and Germans could bomb. Again, we saw what happened in Malta. And so after making landfall and making sort of this peaceful arrangement with D'Hollande, there was this race to get British, American, and Free French forces into Tunisia, and they moved there within 2 weeks of landfall, right? Because we moved from 8th to 16th of November, 1942. Now 25th to 10th of December, 1942 is the attack. And this attack moved incredibly quickly, and it moved so quickly that significant numbers of German and Italians were captured as POWs. They were unable to get out of Tunisia. On the flip side, and we're going to talk about this more when we talk about North Africa, during the period when the Vichy government was in control, because Tunisia was a protectorate, they had the Bey or the Prince, and he was the king of effectively the king of Tunisia, despite the fact that he had very limited actual power. And the Bey at this time was Monsef. He took power in 1942, and he submitted to the Vichy government articles demanding the independence of Tunisia. The Axis did not take those terribly well. And in fact, while he was in power, the Nazis took direct military control of Tunisia. We're going to see how that manifests in a bit. But when the Free French, the Americans and the British were able to take control of Tunisia, they forcibly retired Monsif Bey and promoted his brother, who was far more congenial to their demands, Mohammed Alamein, who was known as Lamin Bey. And you can see de Gaulle there with Lamin and the new resident general of the Protectorate, now that it was back in Free French hands. So while we have all of this war going on in terms of the actual borders and positions, we also have an incredibly difficult domestic situation. Now, of course, nothing should detract from the suffering that the Muslim populations and some of the colonial settler Christian populations underwent as a result of World War II. We're talking about the Pied Noir in Algeria and the Italians in Tunisia and Libya, if we're speaking about the colonial settler population, but Muslims and Jews existed throughout this area. And the Jews were particularly put upon as a result of the Holocaust coming to North Africa. This is part of the story of the Holocaust that people are generally not as familiar with. Now, there were, of course, Jews who were deported, especially from Morocco and Tunisia, to the European death camps. You can see this is Maurice Ben Zaken, who was a Moroccan Jew, and his ashes were discovered along with some of his personal effects in Sobibor. So it's believed that he was gassed at Sobibor. But you also have concentration camps in Africa. Now, we should be clear, these are concentration camps, not death camps. The difference being a concentration camp is where you are forced to perform a lot of acts of hard labor. You are poorly fed, diseases rampant, but the goal of the camp is not extermination, right? That happens as a result of the hard labor and the torture and everything else. The death camps were designed to liquidate people, right? So if you arrived in a death camp, either you were put in the labor part of that camp or you were dead within 24 hours, right? So that's the difference. There's a question as to whether there were Polish populations in those camps. Absolutely. Like Sobibor was a camp in Poland. So the majority of those killed in Sobibor were Polish, Belarusian, Russian Jews. What's surprising for a lot of people is that there were also a very small percentage, we're talking about a few hundred, African-born Jews who were also exterminated in the camps in Europe. And there were a couple camps that I sort of want to point out. There's Jado in northwestern Libya. It's actually close to the Tunisian border. Jado was the largest single concentration camp, and it had a significant population of Jews, specifically because when the Germans and Italians kept fighting this sort of seesaw action, the Italians would advance, the British would push them back, the Germans would advance, the British pushed them back, the Germans advanced again, then you had the Battle of Alamein, the two battles of Alamein, and then the British pushed them back. So you had this sort of seesaw effect. And the Jews, of course, were more amenable to the times when they were under British occupation than under Italo-German occupation, because under British occupation, they were equal with the rest of the population. When they were under Italo-German control, obviously that was not the case. And so the Jews of Libya were considered to be a fifth column and traitors, which is why they were rounded up by the Italian leadership and put in Jado. We don't have a lot of pictures from these labor camps, so it's incredibly fortunate, let's say, that we have pictures of the Imfout camp. Imfout is in Morocco, and this camp had the distinction of not just housing Jews, but also other foreigners, other individuals that were accused of operating against the Nazi regime with either Free French, British, or Americans. And one of these people is Sami Doura. He was a French citizen of Lebanese Jewish extraction. He had done business in Morocco, was living in Morocco, and he was in the camp. You can see the dam below. That was part of their hard labor, was building that dam. You also have different situations in terms of the civil rights of Jews. You have, for example, under Moroccan leadership, King Mohammed V, refused to allow any demarcation in the populations between the Jews and the Muslims of Morocco, saying that all Moroccans are Moroccans and that he didn't see any distinction. There were, however, other situations. For example, we talked about with Monsef Bey in Tunisia. He had little direct control over the territory. That territory was administered by a Nazi SS officer, Walter Rauff. You can see his picture in the center there. And Walter Rauff required Jews to wear the yellow Star of David and other identifying figures. He also assembled Comité Spécial to run the Jewish communities, very similar to the Judenrat that existed in the European ghettos. And in Tunisia is where we have the most organized deportations and organizations of Nazis, of the Jews, in order to either put them into camps or otherwise. There are over 40 known camps across Northern Africa that were part of this piece, this small piece of the Holocaust. So, hard left. Now we move to the Arabian Peninsula, and the Arabian Peninsula is a sort of weird thing in that it was very much at the periphery of the world and the war, which is surprising given how central Arabia seems to be when it comes to wars today. And this is because, by and large, the oil production capabilities were just in their experimental phase. We talked about in episode 52 that Aramco was only beginning to find oil in Saudi in the late 1920s and exploit it in the early 1930s. I think Dhahran really came into the fore in 1934. And you can see here, this is Ibn Saud, the leader of Saudi Arabia from the 1920s until 1953. This is actually the furthest away from Saudi Arabia he had ever been in his life and ever would be. This is in Egypt. He didn't travel very far. In fact, he was on a US naval ship close to Egypt. And it's here where he meets Roosevelt. Roosevelt tries to persuade him of two major things. One thing is to turn on the oil tap for the Allies, and the other is to permit the state of Israel, a Jewish state, to come into existence in the Middle East. One he agrees to, one he does not. I'll give you three guesses as to which. So you have this situation of Saudi Arabia really only joining the Allies as at the end of the war, February of 1945, similar to Turkey. And for them, it's simply just turning on the oil spout. The Yemeni are divided. North and South Yemen are two different countries. And country is a very loose term. If we were talking about South Yemen, it was a British protectorate of a number of conflicting tribal entities. And as part of the British Empire, they were part and parcel of the war. There were a number of attempts to use Yemeni bases to protect British shipping coming from India. But because of their proximity to Italian-controlled Eritrea, Italian-controlled Ethiopia, because they had invaded it in 1935, and Italian-controlled Somalia, there were Italian planes that were consistently bombing southern Yemen, and that made it impossible to use. By contrast, Oman was far enough away, and also within the British sphere of influence, as we discussed in several of the previous episodes, that a number of tarmacs were built in Oman for the British Empire, and Omanis even put together a fund to purchase 10 Spitfires for the British. And you can see one of them is there with the word Muscat, the capital of Yemen, emblazoned on its side. You can also talk about Bahrain. Bahrain was an island country in the Persian Gulf, and Bahrain was actually bombed once by the Italians in October of 1940. And as Mark was pointing out earlier, the more different fronts that the Axis parties could create for the British, the less British troops they would have at any single front. And that was the goal of the bombing of Bahrain, even considering how remote it was from all of the situations. The one interesting thing, I think, out of all this, the most interesting one, is actually North Yemen, or the Mutawakkilite Kingdom of Yemen, led by Imam Yahya. And his country in the 1930s had been aligned with the Italians against the British. to try and secure Yemeni independence. And Yemen during World War II is one of the only countries in the world that was entirely neutral during the war, did not provide any assistance to the Italians, did not provide any assistance to the British, and turned entirely internal during the war. Now, we talked about Egypt from the Allied perspective. I just want to take a second to talk about it from the Egyptian perspective. We did cover this last time we met 2 weeks ago, but it's important to sort of hash this out again. The Egyptians were by and large anti-British, despite the fact that they were part of the British Empire. And King Farouk was very much opposed to kicking out the Italians, despite the fact that the British treaties, like the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936, required them to take the British side in the war. There's that very famous quote that Miles Lamson had when he was confronting King Farouk. And Miles Lamson, for clarity, had an Italian wife. Farouk said to him, I'll get rid of my Italians when you get rid of yours. So the British didn't take this lying down. And in 1942, in February of 1942, the British actually surrounded Abdin Palace, where King Farouk was, and forcibly removed Ali Mahir, who was his prime minister, and required him to institute Mustafa al-Nahas, who was known for being more pro-British, and to create a pro-British policy in Egypt. Now, despite Egypt being a neutral country, and Egypt stayed neutral throughout the war, 1,125 Egyptians did die for the cause of the Allies, and they died primarily maintaining telegraph lines, defensive positions, all against the Axis bombers and strafing. Now, if you see the Marsa Matruh cemetery, that cemetery is for English dead. That cemetery is not for Egyptian dead who are buried elsewhere. We also have the situation in Mandatory Palestine. And in Mandatory Palestine, of course, you have the Zionist Yishuv, the Zionist settlement, and you also have what I'm going to call anachronistically the Palestinians, the Arab population of the territory. Now, that population had two very different responses to the British call to arms. The Zionist Yishuv, led by David Ben-Gurion, who became eventually their first prime minister of Israel, had the position that we should fight the Nazis as if there were no white paper, the white paper referring to that British document created in 1939 that would prevent Jewish immigration to the Mandate, especially bad timed, given the very need that Jews had to escape Europe at the moment. But to fight the Nazis as if there were no white paper, which was a source of friction between the Jews and the British, and to fight the British in Palestine as if there was no war, right? And this referred to the clandestine activities that they would take against the British governing officials within the territory of the Mandate of Palestine in order to unseat the British. There was the position from the Palestinians was far more muted. As we talked about in our presentation on Zionism in episodes 56 and 57, there was a strong pro-Nazi contingent within the Palestinian population, not because the Nazis had any especially attractive message that did happen in Iraq, but because the Nazis were primarily opposed to the British and the French, and the enemy of my enemy. So when British tried to recruit in the territory of the Mandate, even though they tried to keep it even keel with an even number of Jews to form what was called the Jewish Legion and an equal number of Palestinians to form an Arab Legion, they ended up getting 3 times as many Jewish recruits as they did Arab recruits. And many of these Jews fought with distinction in the European theaters. Probably the most famous is the martyr Hannah Senesh, who you can see there. And she was sent to infiltrate Hungary. She was discovered by the Hungarian border guards. She was born in Hungary. She moved as a pioneer, a Khalutza, Mandate of Palestine, and she went back to Europe. But she was discovered. She was tortured. She revealed no information about her mission, and she was executed by the Nazi regime. We also talked a little bit about the Jordanians in that same presentation, and we pointed out that the Jordanians had a very pro-British position. You had British commanders who were part and parcel of the Jordanian government. There's a point here that Khan Hassan parachuted into Hungary. That's absolutely correct. But she was discovered by border officials and administrative officials. As I was saying, in Jordan, in Transjordan at the time, the administration of Abdullah I included a number of British military leaders. Probably the most important was Lieutenant General John Bagot Glubb, who was dubbed by the Jordanians as Glubb Pasha, and his Arab Legion, which was the best trained Arab army in all of the Middle East. And that Arab trained army had a disproportionate number of non-Arabs in it, especially those who were Circassian or Bedouin. Both of those ethnicities having a minority status within Jordan, but a celebrated military status. And among the Circassians that became part of the military, you include a number of other peoples from the Caucasus. They're all called Circassians within the wider sort of Jordanian world. But one of them, for example, is this Chechen war hero, Alauddin Arslan, who has been decorated for numerous military actions, including what he did during World War II, which was the Arab Legion's involvement in the Anglo-Iraqi War. Now, Mark had described a bit of this conflict in some of our previous episodes, but this was a situation where the Nazis, as we talked about, were advancing in Egypt, they were advancing in other places, and they wanted access to Iraq's petroleum. And it looked like they might get their chance when you had the Golden Square coup. The Nazis had been making inroads with the Iraqi government in the 1930s. Ambassador Fritz Groba was meeting especially with King Ghazi, who was more pro-Nazi. He ruled from 1936 to 1939 when he was car accidented to death. It was quite clear to everybody involved that the car accident was not an accident. But those relations had really grown, and there was a significant pro-Nazi cadre in the government of Iraq, those who were opposed to the way that the British were handling the Kingdom of Iraq, which was effectively a colony, and wanted to press for more independence, which they felt that the Nazis could provide. And so 4 military generals led by Salahuddin al-Sabah ended up overthrowing the government in April of 1941 and installing pro-Nazi ministers like Rashid Ali al-Gailani in power over Iraq. That government survived for about 2 months. But in those 2 months, the Nazis saw an opportunity to support a fledgling Arab state in favor of the Axis. And you can see the Fliegerführer, these were German bombers that were sent by the Luftwaffe to Iraq. As we pointed out, the easiest way would have been for the Nazis to send people overland through Turkey, but Turkey prohibited that under İnönü. And so the British had the opportunity bringing in soldiers from Indians who landed in Kuwait, and those Arab Legion officers, along with British soldiers arriving from the Transjordanian side. They invaded by the end of May, and they put down the revolt. It's worth pointing out, however, that before the British got to Baghdad, and they actually remained outside of the city for a few days. On the 1st and 2nd of June, as Baghdad was ready to fall, a large-scale pogrom occurred in Baghdad. This was the largest pogrom in the history of the Arab world, largest single pogrom. 200 are believed to have been killed, 700 to 800 wounded, and this is called the Farhud. It occurred on the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, the 1st and 2nd of June, 1941. It's worth pointing out, and I didn't mention it on the Iraq episode, that following World War II, the amount of anti-Semitic propaganda that had proliferated in Iraq during this period had reached such a fever pitch that anti-Zionism was insufficient of a policy from Nouri al-Said to maintain his position as prime minister of the country. And so he began attacking the Jewish population and eventually permitting them to leave in 1950. And when he did so, over 80% of the Iraqi Jewish population left in the following 2 years, given the negative climate with which they were faced. It's also worth pointing out that the British used their local minorities that had supported them in this invasion. So it wasn't just the Arab Legion, but the Assyrian levies. These were British formed ranks of the Iraqi Christian minority, the Assyrians. Primarily, there were also some Turkmen and Kurds in those units. And they were a huge part of the British defense of the British Air Force Base, Habaniya. That was a key aspect of the way that the British were trying to fight on the western side of that Iraq invasion. And then following that success, the British and the Indian troops under their lead went to Syria and Lebanon to free it from the Vichy French government. Mark, do you want to comment on any of this?
There we go. All right. This was very much a kind of a backwater of the war, but it was within the context of the British being very hard pressed in the Mediterranean. Just before Operation Barbarossa, the British had suspected that the Germans were going to invade the Soviet Union. They told Stalin, but they were still afraid of being squeezed by the Germans in the Eastern Mediterranean. The North African campaign had not been resolved yet. So they, in June or July of 1941, Churchill ordered the British commander to take troops from the Western Desert into Palestine and Transjordan and basically invade and take over the French mandates of Syria and Lebanon, who were loyal to Vichy and seriously so. So the British also had a very small amount of Free French troops. So the whole thing took a number of weeks. The Vichy troops fought well, but had no way of getting any reinforcements or resupplies or anything. So they were quite isolated, didn't stand much of a chance. The British, with their very much their some British, some Australian, and Indian troops, besides the Free French, were able to take over in 6 or 8 weeks, and then after that they transferred control over to de Gaulle and the Free French.
Absolutely, and as we've discussed during the Syria presentation, episode 54, the relationship between the Free French and the British almost came to military blows in the context of control over Syria and the determination of Syria's future, ultimately with the British supporting the nationalist Shukri al-Quwatli in allowing Quwatli to declare independence for the Syrian Republic. So now we're going to shift to the final theater of the war in the Middle East, which is the Iranian world. And as we mentioned in episode 51, Reza Shah had been in power since 1921, since he forced the British out in a coup. And he had consolidated power within the country. At that same time, he tried to make allies both in the country and outside of the country. And the Nazis were a particularly interesting ally for him because the Germans, number one, were a massive importing and exporting partner. In fact, Germany was the biggest destination for Iranian exports other than the Soviet Union. And that began to change rather quickly. And many German industrial imports were a huge part of the modernization that Reza Shah was performing in the 1930s. Additionally, the Germans had no history of occupying and controlling parts of Iran. And as we've spoken about in several of the previous episodes, much of Iran's 19th century and 20th century history up to this point was trying to keep the British and the Russians, now the Soviets, out of Iranian affairs. And trying to limit their ability to control Iranian destiny. In fact, Iran tries to reach out during this period to its neighbors, to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkey, to Afghanistan, and to Iraq when that is possible, under their quasi-independent kingdom. And despite all of this, when push comes to shove and the British and the Soviets need a way to transfer goods to each other, they end up jointly invading Iran in what's called Operation Countenance. And this is a very quick operation. It takes about 7 days, where most of the British troops are coming from India. And so you have a disproportionate number of Indians there, and they meet the Soviets coming from the north. Then they both arrive in Tehran and they overthrow the government, put Reza Shah into exile, and promote his young teenage son, Mohammad Reza, to the role of Shah because he was more amenable to British control. Does anybody want to comment on Operation Countenance before I move forward?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing to recognize is, given the scale of World War II and given the requirements that the Soviets had in terms of logistics and support, and I think most people might not be aware of the scale of logistic support from the West and ultimately from the United States, where the United States provided, in many cases, 3/4 of the large-scale armaments that were developed, whether it was aircraft, trucks, heavy and medium weapon systems, so that the Soviets could sustain their fight against the Germans over the subsequent 2-3 years. And so Iran, it became, fundamentally a logistics war, and Iran was arguably a center of gravity of that, especially through that region, because the majority of the logistics support came through Iran and the Caucasus to support the Soviets on the southeastern front.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Of the entire Lend-Lease Act, it's estimated about 17 million tons of goods were sent to the Soviet Union for the prosecution of the war. Of that 17 million, 8 million tons of those passed through Iran alone, making it the largest single possibility. And now it's important to understand what this did to Iran, this occupation did to Iran. And so in January of 1942, not long after, about a year and change after Iran was divided between the Soviets and the British in terms of occupation zones, there was what was called the Tripartite Treaty of Alliance. And under this treaty, the two powers agreed that they would respect Iranian sovereignty and that they would remove their forces 6 months after the termination of the war. But in return, the British and the Soviets would have full and complete control over all of the transportation networks within Iran. And this was crucial for getting all of those goods to the Soviet Union through Iran, either from India as an origin point or from other parts of the world. And of course, those of you who are familiar with India know that the rerouting of supplies to other parts of the British Empire caused significant hardship in India, including the 1942 to 1943 Bengal famine. And that famine was not unique to India, although India was probably the hardest hit of any part of the world. Iran was similarly hit because the centralization of all of Iran's transportation networks meant that significant portions of grain from the verdant north couldn't make their way to the semi-arid and arid south. And so you had large numbers of people dying because of that. Additionally, the British and Soviets put a lot of people to corvée labor, which in itself wasn't necessarily overly burdensome, but it meant that significant people were not farming who otherwise would be, which led to crop shortfalls as well. Add that to a bad weather system in 1942, 4 million, it's believed, between 3 to 4 million Iranians died as a result of this massive Allied created famine. Now, you also had the Soviets operating in a way to expand the reach of communism and to create buffer states. We are familiar with this process in Eastern Europe, the creation of the Soviet satellite states, and the incorporation of former neighbor states to the Soviet Union, like the Baltic countries, into the Soviet Union through the process of war conquest. In Iran, this was no different. And in fact, the Soviets were laying the grounding blocks during World War II to split off the northwestern portion of Iran into two autonomous republics: the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan, which would be made of Azerbaijani Turks, the same ethnicity as those in the Republic of Azerbaijan today. In fact, there are more Azerbaijanis in Iran itself than there are in Azerbaijan, the Republic. It is, however, important to note that the Azerbaijanis in Iran never saw themselves, as a general matter, as being distinct from the larger nation of Iran, and in fact were a historically huge component of the Persian majority governments. They were disproportionately represented. So the creation of an autonomous Azerbaijani Republic was contrary to most of history. And in fact, when we talked about the disintegration of Iran, the Azerbaijani region, which did have revolts, had revolts for the creation of a new Iranian state, not for the secession of the region, which was different from the other revolts we saw in episode 51. Now, the Kurds got their own republic, the Republic of Mahabad. And similarly, this was a Soviet-supported, communist-aligned government, and these would only be dismantled in 1946, when under UN pressure and United States pressure, the Soviets were forced to withdraw from the northern part of Iran. It's worth pointing out that because of Iran's centrality, despite being a neutral state, in the progression of the war, that the Big Three convened in Tehran in November of 1943, and that meeting really crystallized a lot of the future missions of those groups of people. It was where the D-Day invasion of France, Operation Overlord, was discussed. It discussed the possible partition of Europe between states with a Soviet influence and states with a Western influence in the western part of the continent, and many other post-war conditions. And it was repeated to Iran that the parties would leave at the end of the war. The British did leave, the Soviets did not. There has never been, as far as I'm aware, any rapprochement from the British or Russian governments or Soviet government apologizing for the famine, and it's often not talked about. There's finally one last thing that I want to address when we talk about Iran under occupation, which is that a number, as the Soviet Union was beginning to try and improve relations with the British and the Americans, as a result of the war continuing and needing those alliances, many individuals who had been taken during the Soviet annexation of Eastern Poland, which occurred in 1939, those individuals had been brought into the gulags, and included a number of Jews as well as Polish refugees. Those individuals were shipped originally to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which were part of the Soviet Union at the time. And then from there, they were sent to Iran. So this also compounded the famine issue, because these refugees needed something to eat as well. In particular, the most famous group of Jewish refugees were the Tehran children, who were about 1,000 Jewish orphaned because of the Holocaust. And they made their way through Iran to mandatory Palestine. That said, Iran also hosted people from the Axis who were fleeing. Rashid Ali al-Gailani from the Iraqi coup also fled to Iran. And because of Iran's stated neutrality, despite its being overtaken by the Allies, there was a safe place for Ali al-Gailani to stay until he could find better accommodations in Nazi Germany. There's a question. It is amazing that Shiite Azerbaijan has relations with Israel. In many cases, in many things, the Shiite majority Republic of Azerbaijan is very afraid of Iran annexing it, because historically Azerbaijan has been part of Iran. And so that anti-Iranian bent of the current Republic of Azerbaijan fits very nicely with Israel's current fixed position of being opposed to Iran because of Iran's negative attitude towards Israel. Aaron, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. So one thing I want to add about the 1943 Big Three conference that I think would be interesting for most people to dig into is arguably one of the greatest assassination plots in history was attempted by the Germans. It was broken up. It was Operation Long Jump, where the objective was to assassinate, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Which, obviously, if that succeeded, I mean, I think it goes down in the annals as a more impressive assassination than Caesar or Saladin, or all the usual historic suspects that were assassinated, given the implications of it. So for those of you that are sort of interested in this spy versus spy type of environment that Iran was from 42 on, given all the parties that were involved there, it's actually, to me, one of the more interesting and sort of fascinating areas of the world. In some ways, Casablanca was trying to sort of create a version of what was really happening in Tehran and across Iran. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And speaking of parties operating in Iran, when the Soviets created the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan, they really gave the juice, for want of a better term, to the Tudeh party, which would eventually become the Communist Party that we associate with the overthrow of the Shah. They
That's
cooperated with the Islamists in that overthrow.
And even to this day, there's several radical communist, you can almost call them mini parties or almost mini guerrilla groups that are both Iranian, Kurdish. They're not significant actors in the modern politics of the Kurds and Iran, except as either a foil or as what you would argue sort of modern sort of nationalist terrorist groups, and those go back. When you trace them back, they go back to sort of a regeneration, somewhat of a Maoist regeneration in the 60s and 70s, and then you trace back, before that to a Stalinist Leninist creation in the 30s and 40s. So there's a there's a continuation in many of these purely communist groups that are still there, and really all over the world. I mean, they're in Latin America, in South Asia, North Asia, even. People forget there's small communist groups in India still, in Tibet and Bhutan. I mean, it's just almost everywhere you can pull on the string, you can see that. So
yeah, and the last thing to discuss, it's amazing, we're going to be right on time, is Operation Edelweiss. Now, of course, there have been entire television series done on the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany in 1941 to 1942. And we're literally looking at the southernmost corner of that situation. So you can see, actually, if you look at that more in-depth map, the area inside of the fuchsia-colored circle, that's Stalingrad. And if you look further to the south in the orange circle, that's the area of the Caucasus region, right? That's, in particular, that circle corresponds to the northern part of Azerbaijan and the southern part of Dagestan, for those who know the region. Now, one of the primary goals of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was access to Baku in Azerbaijan, at the very bottom of that map, where you had massive oil refineries. And from July to November of 1942, you had attempts by the Germans to continually push further and further south, in a significantly larger campaign than any of the campaigns that we've looked at today. But because of the drain of resources that was Stalingrad, by and large, that ended up failing. And the Soviets were able, starting in January of 1943, to start pushing back. You can see the Soviets in Mozdok, which is the capital of North Ossetia, which is a Caucasus state within the Soviet Union. Today, it's still in Russia, but it's just north of the Georgian border. And that would be the beginning of the Soviet push to liberate those territories. Now, In addition to Operation Edelweiss, it's important to point out that Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as constituent parts of the Soviet Union, did give up in terms of men and treasure in order to help the Soviet Union at large fight off the Nazis. It's believed that around 600,000 Azerbaijanis were conscripted or fought on the Soviet side, about half that number of Armenians, but the Armenian population is significantly smaller, and roughly the same of Georgians fighting alongside other Soviet citizens in the defense of the country. Aaron, would you like to talk a little bit about Edelweiss?
Yes. So, I mean, it's almost like it's a for those of you that have any sort of historical appreciation of sports, it's almost like a heavyweight championship of, it's Ali Frazier type fight where the large scale invasion by the Germans, which was initially really a large scale armored invasion and thrust. It was made up of nearly 1,200 tanks and about 5,000 guns and mortars, and basically the population, it's a large scale depopulation exercise, obviously, and the Soviets took huge losses initially, and then once they were able to reorganize, and I think one of the major strategic miscalculations that amongst the hundreds that the Germans had was not fully appreciating that launching a thrust that far south, that close to what was ultimately arguably one of the 2 or 3 large logistics hubs on Earth, that and in terms of war material, probably maybe the second largest, that was getting resupplied by the United States, compressed all of those logistics for the Soviets. So when they were able to launch Operation Little Saturn, the scale of that operation was nearly 20 times larger than the forces they had that blocked or tried to block the initial invasion and retreated, and they had nearly 10-15 times as many tanks, and more importantly, they had 5 times as many aircraft, and the most important thing is the amount of guns and mortars they had. They had over 12,000. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen that many concentrated in one area. And in some ways, the modern history sort of definition that when we say Russia or Soviet, God of war is artillery, was really sort of instantiated here. And ultimately the Germans obviously could never recover from the scale of these losses, and especially as they just kept throwing forces and materiel at this, which was ultimately obviously a losing battle. And really in some ways it's sort of underappreciated how much of the world, because this was pre invasion of Western Europe, as much of the Allied world was concentrating the amount of resources they were concentrating here to support the Soviets, because obviously if the Germans could sustain this thrust and penetrate through the southern corridor into Mother Russia, that would have represented an extremely dangerous challenge, ultimately probably pretty existential, and it would have, it just would have shook up the whole balance pretty dramatically. It would have forced, I think, a much broader front in the West to try to challenge the Germans to take pressure off the East.
Mark, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, a couple of things that one of the major reasons why Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union was to gain control over those oil resources in the very southern Russia, as opposed to just buying the oil that the Stalin was selling them. And by the time that the Germans started Operation Blau, which was the invasion or I should say the offensive in 1942, there was an argument between Hitler and his generals. The generals said, we only have enough resources to get to the Volga and block traffic coming north and south. Hitler insisted on taking some of that thrust and then taking it a right turn towards the Caucasus to get at the oil production, if only because he knew that to what extent Germany needed that oil and needed it quickly. And one of the things that the leadership of the Germans just idiotically thought all they needed to do was grab the territory and the oil was theirs, that the Russians were not going to do anything about it. And that one of the things that they really thought, all we have to do is capture these facilities, they'll fall in our hands, no problem. They didn't think that the Russians would sabotage all those all that oil production, and which anything that fell under the German hands, they did. They got nothing out of what they captured.
And they didn't just sabotage facilities. They would intentionally give Germans incorrect information about the location of facilities.
That's right.
So the Germans would enter areas where there was some oil, but not a lot. And so they were consistently underwhelmed with what they were discovering.
And one thing to give more credit to the Azerbaijanis is that the Baku Air Defense Army, which doesn't usually roll off a historian's tongues, but it should. They were absolutely strategic in applying enormous continuous pressure to German Luftwaffe and at the same time creating constant air reconnaissance and close air support against German forces. They had, I mean, you could argue, if for those of you that are sort of interested, they were really sort of I'd say an incredible revolutionary level sort of military innovation in terms of a unit. The amount of sort of specialized capabilities. They had things that, they had a searchlight regiment. They had a balloon regiment. They had, these just huge amounts of sort of specialization, which were, basically fit for purpose against the, German capabilities of the Luftwaffe and the German air defense, and then ultimately, the German ground forces, and then also the destruction of those oil fields, which they obviously participated in, pretty substantially. So it's another one of these, let's say underappreciated, the people in history or groups of people in history or units.
And I think that's a perfect way to close this out, because this entire presentation tonight has been about people who, generally speaking, are not part of the the World War II discussion. The World War II discussion is always, Hitler versus Stalin and like who's going to win. And tonight we talked about the people of Egypt, the people of Morocco, the people of Yemen, the people of Iraq, Iran, and now the Southern Caucasus. And I think that's a fantastic way to sort of end this. And so questions, comments, concerns, I'm going, while those roll in, and also if you have a question, you want to raise your hand, and so that way I can unmute you and we can talk, we can do it that way. Welcome to our group History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. This is the Middle Eastern Islamic History, which we meet weekly. That said, I'm taking 4 weeks of break. We're going to reconvene on the 19th of January for our episode on the Maghreb region, Northern Africa, from 1880 until World War II. And then we are going to do all kinds of fun stuff, talking about the post-war environment, and where politics really becomes interesting if you didn't think they were interesting already, because we are in the modern period where Arab countries are independent, the Middle East has convulsions and revolutions of its own. Where we also have our group that talks about Greco-Roman civilization that meet periodically. We have our Asian philosophy with Jason Peng that meets on Saturdays. Aaron and I do European Union security. We're probably going to have our next meeting for that in February. We have our Powerful Women series with Jane Prendergast, our Dead Languages series with John Maloney, and Aaron and I will put together the coalition to do our Russo-Ukrainian War series in January, where we'll cover everything we've missed since October. And you can see all of the other things that we've worked on all at our YouTube page. I put the links to our YouTube page, our meetup group, and PayPal information, if you feel so inclined, in the chat. And you can also see it here on the screen. One question that I have in the chat already is, why does Iran have such a strong relationship with Armenia today, despite Armenia being a Christian state? And it really comes down to the fact that because Armenia isn't connected to the Western powers, Armenia is not a country that is following through on sanctions against Iran. And therefore, it's a natural place where Iranians can buy and sell goods and connect to the outside world. And also, Armenia is locked into an anti-Azerbaijani position, and the Iranian government is desirous of bringing Azerbaijan into a more Iranian orbit. So they are naturally in opposition to Azerbaijan. So Armenia being locked into opposition with Azerbaijan makes Armenia a natural ally. And it also helps cement Iran's relationship with Russia, which is a key regional partner for Iran in terms of their long-term stability. I also want to thank everybody for their experiences that they shared. It's really incredible that now we're getting to a part of history where it's people's parents or people's grandparents. It's a little different from when, I was talking about the Kapurli viziers in the 1650s, and nobody knows anything. We're starting to talk about things that actually, touch people's lives, and that's fantastic.
One other quick thing I wanted to bring up, which we didn't have a chance to, which maybe we could bring up in the future session, is to talk a little bit about the 1940 to 44 Chechnya insurgency, which is really fascinating because there were two brothers, Hussein and Hassan Izilov, and they started this insurgency against the Soviets, and they were ex-communists, Trotskyites, and they wound up, let's just say, parallel aligned to the Germans, almost the way the Finns were. Yeah. And that ultimately led, which most people aren't very familiar with,
the Chechen deportations.
Exactly, which was the Chechen English, deportations, which are, at least somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people that were mass deported. I mean, this isn't a slow deportation. This is 150,000 NKVD officers implementing a deportation in a matter of weeks. And it's estimated about a quarter of the people, perished in that. And so I think this might be something in the real, specific histories that we could maybe roll in here in the future, or for anyone that's interested, you can just do a Google on it, and it was classified as a act of genocide by the European Parliament in 2004. So but the reason I bring this up is most people don't have this understanding. I think even a lot of people who have a background in Eastern Europe and Caucasus, of why you had this incessant sort of civil war and fight in Chechnya in the 90s or in other periods. And it draws all the way back to this period that we've been talking about in the last couple hours.
And even further back, we talked about
absolutely
the Russian conquest of the Caucasus.
That's right. That's right.
That was back, episode 30 something, I'm sure, episode 40 something, where, there were all these different Caucasian confederations, and the Russians spent 50 years doing everything in their power to exterminate those who would oppose them, and empower those who would support them.
Yep. And just so everyone knows, it has one of the weirdest names of an operation ever, Operation Lentil. like lentil soup. I mean, literally. So, and that was a reference to, you know, the soup, obviously, that they ate. But yeah, I mean, that's, I think, you know, where you really get some of this deepest history. And I really love how we really drilled into that in this session today.
Well, I hope that everybody enjoyed our quote Christmas special, where everybody got to sort of join in and talk a little bit about what excites them about World War II in this part of the world. And I look forward to seeing everybody in the new year. So thank you for coming, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. And I'll see you in January.
Yep. Hope everyone has a great set of holidays, New Year.